Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And it is wonderful to be here celebrating our freedoms. I got to say, y'all know how to make a Texan feel at home. Live free or die. That is an attitude Texans can understand. It is great to be with us, and I got to say, we are here at a time when liberty is under assault. We're here at a time when never before has the federal government so come after our constitutional liberties as it's doing today. And I want to give you a word of encouragement. People are waking up.
Yes.
They are waking up here in New Hampshire. They are waking up all over the country. People are realizing, holy cow, this doesn't make any sense. This is crazy. And all across this country, what we're seeing is people who want to get back to the common sense principles this country was built on. Basic principles like live within your means. Don't bankrupt our kids and grandkids. And follow the Constitution.
Always important.
Now, it is only in Washington, D.C. that those are viewed as radical and extreme ideas.
In California.
If you bring together any gathering of Americans, doesn't matter if they're Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Libertarians, that's basic common sense. Those are the principles America was built on. Now, we're moving into political scene. New Hampshire is both blessed and cursed. That every 4 years politicians descend upon you like locusts. But I got to tell you, the men and women of New Hampshire, America owes you a real debt. Because you perform a critically important function of looking people in the eye and taking the measure, are they telling the truth or are they blowing smoke? If presidential campaigns began in a big state like California or New York, it'd be all slick Hollywood TV ads, and you wouldn't have the opportunity to take the real measure of a man or woman, what they believe, and have they walk the walk. I think this primary election is going to be about a lot of things, but I think at the most fundamental core, it's going to be about trust. We're fed up with politicians who say one thing and do another. And that's the role each of you is performing, is taking the real test. I'll tell you, when I ran for Senate in the state of Texas, when we launched the campaign, I was at 2% in the polls. The margin of error was 3%. I came home to my wife, Heidi, and let me introduce my wife, Heidi. Oh, and I love the hat, armed and fabulous. I came home to Heidi all excited. I said, we're at 2%. And Heidi said, well, sweetheart, technically, couldn't you be at -1? I said, thank you, my love. Yeah, you understand. And what we saw across the state of Texas was a $50 million primary, where we were outspent 3-1. Had $35 million in saturation negative attack ads against us. And yet what we saw was a grassroots movement come across the state. Over and over again. How do you build a grassroots movement? It's real simple. It's the same thing that New Hampshire requires of every candidate, which is that you go to a whole lot of IHOPs and VFW halls and Denny's, and you sit down with citizens and you answer their questions, and you look them in the eyes. And what we saw is it started off with a few dozen. Then it became a few hundred. Then it became a few thousand. then it became tens of thousands. And it was that old Reagan coalition coming together. It was conservatives and libertarians and evangelicals and young people and Hispanics and women and Reagan Democrats. And the most common question in that race is people would look at you and say, how can we trust you? We've been burned so many times. And you know, a point that I made in that campaign over and over again is I said, listen, we understand that a Republican primary, everyone comes along and says they're the most conservative guy you've ever seen. Who diggity, they're conservative. I am confident you're not going to see a Republican come to the state of New Hampshire and say, you know what, I'm an establishment moderate who stands for nothing. They're not going to admit that. So the point I would make in the Senate campaign is, you know, every candidate, you go to their website, they have an issues page. There are a whole series of issues, A, B, C, D, E. And if you took 5 Republicans running statewide in Texas, you printed out their issues pages, they're almost word for word identical. It's like they're reading from a script. You know, if it weren't so darn serious, it'd be funny. And what I would point out all the time is if you go to our webpage, tedcruz.org, tedcruz.org, tedcruz.org. One of the first things people noticed is we didn't have an issues page. Instead, we had a page labeled a proven record. And what it said is, for far too long, politicians have said one thing and done another. Every one of us should ask any candidate who shows up in front of you, you say you believe these principles. Show me. When have you stood up and fought for them? When have you bled for them? And what have you accomplished? As the scriptures say, you shall know them by their fruits. And what then followed was, for the past decade, Ted has been fighting for conservative principles over and over again and winning on a national level. Colon. And 3 pages of bullet points. Eric Holder's cut off our mic. And I'll tell you the example that I used to use in Texas was the Second Amendment. Holder's back at it. All right, we'll switch mics. The example I used to use was the Second Amendment. In Texas, there is a right answer on the Second Amendment. I support the Second Amendment. Unless you are clinically insane, that's the right answer in Texas. Heck, even if you're a Democrat, that's the right answer in the state of Texas. Now, the point I used to make on the campaign trail is that if folks went to our website, I actually didn't say that I supported the Second Amendment. I didn't say a word about what was hidden in the deep recesses of my heart. What I did say is that as the Solicitor General of Texas, the chief lawyer for the state in front of the United States Supreme Court, that I led a coalition of 31 states before the United States Supreme Court defending the right to keep and bear arms, and we won a landmark decision upholding that fundamental right. Yeah. And then I linked to the NRA's 2010 Carter Knight Freedom Fund Award, awarded every year to one of the leading Second Amendment defenders in the country. And that's the difference. I would note, you know, I used to have a former boss who would say, if I'm ever accused of being a Christian, I'd like for there to be enough evidence to convict me. Now, I think that is powerfully true, but it's equally true of being a conservative. It is equally true of being a conservative. If you're really a conservative, you shouldn't have to tell anybody. If you're really a conservative, you should bear the stripes. of being in the fight. You know, to be honest, if I woke up tomorrow and decided I wanted to campaign as a moderate, I couldn't do it. And so when it came to the Senate, I'll give you an example we all remember. Just a few months after I was elected, the horrific shooting that occurred in Newtown, Connecticut. It's heartbreaking. Every one of us who are parents seeing little kids killed by that madman broke your heart. Now, the president could have used that as an opportunity to bring people together. If we had come out of that and said, we're going to go after violent criminals, we're going to come down on violent criminals like a ton of bricks, you could have brought Republicans and Democrats together. That's what we should have done. Instead, what did he do? He used it as an excuse to push his radical anti-gun agenda. He used it as an excuse to go after the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens.
Yep.
Now, when that happened, I serve on the Senate Judiciary Committee. So I tried to take it as an opportunity to stand up for our constitutional rights. Now, some of y'all may have seen an exchange I had with California Democrat Dianne Feinstein, where she had her so-called assault weapon ban. And that was legislation. It specified about 2,000 firearms that were permissible and that weren't permissible. And I asked Senator Feinstein a question in the course of that markup. I said, Senator Feinstein, as you know, the Second Amendment says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And the words, the right of the people, when the framers used that in the Bill of Rights, that was a term of art. Those same words appear in the First Amendment, the right of the people to peaceably assemble. And they appear in the Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be free from unreasonable search and seizure. And every time the framers used those terms, it referred to an individual right. And I said my question that I would ask the senior senator from California. Her legislation identifies firearms that are within protection and without the protection. Would she also support, under the First Amendment, legislation enumerating which books are protected by the First Amendment and which books are not? And would she support legislation under the Fourth Amendment enumerating which people's homes are protected by the Fourth Amendment and which are not? I have to admit, her response was not what I anticipated. She responded with great offense. I am not a sixth grader. That was her response, which I was quite astonished. Look, I wouldn't have asked that question of a sixth grader. But in the course of the back and forth, initially she didn't answer the question. And then finally, when I pointed out she didn't answer the question, she came back and said, you don't understand. It's our job to pass legislation. It's the court's job to figure out whether or not it's constitutional.
I saw that.
And you're exactly right. It was reminiscent of Nancy Pelosi. You got to pass it to find out what's in it, or also with Obamacare, where she was asked, is it constitutional? And she responded, are you serious? Are you serious? And you know, sadly, I did understand there are far too many elected officials in Congress who don't take seriously their oath to support the Constitution.
Right. That's right.
Now, I'll tell you, in Washington, in the weeks and months that followed Newtown, conventional wisdom was the president's gun control legislation was unstoppable. I got to tell you, if y'all were sitting in the Senate Republican lunches, you'd have jumped out the window. Because the sentiment there was, this is a freight train, it can't be stopped, get out of the way. And I was proud to join with my friends Mike Lee and Rand Paul in drafting a very short letter to Senator Reid that said, we will filibuster any legislation that undermines the right to keep and bear arms. Now, we sent that letter on a Friday before a 2-week recess. And all of the Washington establishment was horrified that we would do such a thing. Well, what happened, all of the senators went home to their states. They started doing town halls. And suddenly, the citizens of their states would say, hey, these guys are fighting for the Second Amendment, how about you? They didn't like that. So over the course of the 2 weeks, of the 3 people on that letter became 18. Then we came back to Washington and we had the first vote. We needed to get to 41 to stop the legislation. We got to 31. And all of the press celebrated, see, these crazy conservatives have failed miserably. They only got 31 votes. But they didn't understand what we were doing. Look, what we were trying to do was real simple. Slow things down, shine a light, and then give the opportunity for you to engage. Give the opportunity for the men and women across this country to stand up. And when we had 31, suddenly we had a whip count. Suddenly it was very clear that 31 senators had stood up for the Second Amendment, and the others hadn't. And what happened in the weeks that followed is heaven and earth descended on those remaining senators. Their phones started melting down. I remember one of the other senators in our lunches literally made a fist, pounded the table, and said, "My constituents keep calling me." But it's a great illustration of how you change things in Washington, because the grassroots rose up in overwhelming numbers. And a couple of weeks later, when we went to the Senate floor, every single one of President Obama's proposals to undermine the Second Amendment was voted down. That's the power of the grassroots. That's the power of the American people standing up for our liberties. Our liberties and the Bill of Rights are under assault right now. And we've got to do that same thing, but on an even bigger scale. Final thing I'm going to say, and then we're going to open it up to questions, is a word of encouragement. You know, Scripture tells us, Book of Ecclesiastes says there's nothing new under the sun. I think where we are right now is very much like the late 1970s. I think the parallels between Barack Obama and Jimmy Carter are uncanny.
This one's on steroids.
You know, same failed economic policy, same misery, stagnation, and malaise, same feckless and naive foreign policy. In fact, the exact same countries, Russia and Iran, openly laughing at and mocking the President of the United States.
That's the first.
The one person thrilled in America with the job Barack Obama's doing is Jimmy Carter. And the reason that analogy is so encouraging is we remember how that story ends. All across this country, millions of men and women rose up and became the Reagan Revolution. And it didn't come from Washington. Washington despised Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
If you see a candidate who's embraced by Washington, run and hide. And it came like a tidal wave, and it swept into Washington, and it turned this country around, and it pulled us back from the brink.
Right.
The reason I'm optimistic is the same thing has happened. In New Hampshire and all across the country, millions of people, a whole lot who've never been involved in politics, are saying, holy cow, what are we doing? to this country. We got to get back to the common sense principles that made America great again. It is happening again, and I believe 2016 is going to be an election like 1980, that we are going to win, as Reagan put it, by painting in bold colors, not pale pastels, and standing for the liberty of the American people. Yes, sir.
This week I called Jean Shaheen's office, and I reminded her that I have a letter from her from a previous call. That she told me that she'd never do anything to undermine the Second Amendment. Yet she continues to support Loretta Lynch. Can you let us know a little more about that?
Look, this has been, I have been leading the fight against confirming Loretta Lynch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, I have to admit, when Loretta Lynch was nominated, I wanted to support the nomination, because Eric Holder has been the most partisan, abusive Attorney General in the history of this country. And you want to talk about a radical. Eric Holder has publicly said he views it as his job to, quote, brainwash Americans against guns. You can watch that on video. You know what? That ain't the job of the chief law enforcement officer of the United States of America. Instead, the job is to uphold the Constitution, and the Second Amendment is right there in the Bill of Rights. But when Ms. Lynch came before the Judiciary Committee, I took the opportunity to vigorously question her, and in particular to ask if she was willing to stand for any limits, to uphold any constitutional limits on the authority of this president. And I'm sorry to tell you, in the entire course of the hearing, she could not articulate any limits whatsoever on the power of the president. When it came to executive amnesty, I asked if she stood by the president's illegal and unconstitutional executive amnesty. She said absolutely. I asked if there was any way she would differ from Eric Holder. She said none whatsoever. Now, the latest executive amnesty illegally granted amnesty to some 4 million people here illegally. I asked Loretta Lynch, under her theory of prosecutorial discretion, could the president tomorrow extend that amnesty to all 12 million people living here illegally? She refused to answer that question. I asked, are there any limits to this idea of prosecutorial discretion? For example, could a subsequent president instruct his or her Secretary of the Treasury, we will no longer collect any taxes above 25%? She refused to answer that question. Now listen, that would be great policy. But the way to do it is not through the president ignoring the law, it's to change the tax laws through Congress consistent with the Constitution. I tried to come up with the most absurd hypothetical I could think of. Sitting next to me in the Judiciary Committee was my colleague from Texas, John Cornyn. So I said, imagine in 2017 we have a President Cornyn. Could President Cornyn announce that using prosecutorial discretion, the federal government will no longer enforce any federal environmental law or labor law against any citizen of the state of Texas? She refused to answer that question. That is extreme, it is radical, and in my view, no senator consistent with his or her oath of office to defend the Constitution could vote to confirm an Attorney General who has told us she will not stand for the Constitution.
Yep.
I remember rally, but my question is about education.
Sure.
I have a 2-year-old at home and one more on the way.
Congratulations.
But my fear is they go off to school with this monstrosity of what they'll come for. What can we do about it? What can we do about it?
We need to repeal every word of Common Core. And again, going back, look, I am a passionate defender of the Constitution. I have spent most of my life fighting to defend the Constitution. A critical part of the Constitution is the 10th Amendment to the Bill of Rights. which says the powers not given to the federal government are reserved to the states and to the people. Now that means there are certain responsibilities the federal government needs to do and do well. It needs to defend this country. It needs to support the men and women of the military. It needs to secure the borders.
Yes.
But there are other areas that the federal government has no business sticking its nose, and chief among them is education.
Bingo.
And the reason, which y'all understand, education is too important for it to be governed by unelected bureaucrats in Washington. It needs to be at the state level, or even better, at the local level, where parents have direct control over the curriculum and education of their kids. Yes, sir.
Probably unusual in your audience. I'm from Massachusetts.
We welcome a political refugee.
I've been a lawyer, 40 years practicing down there. I've never fired a gun in my life.
We could correct that today.
Am I the target?
No.
Yeah. But I will say, I want you to be the next president of the United States.
Yes.
Also on Facebook, I have my own little blog, I won't say what it is. I defend you every day.
Thank you.
In Massachusetts, wherever else. It's not easy being a conservative in Massachusetts.
That's true.
Yeah. How are you going to convince my ilk, if you're even going to bother,
Yeah.
to come on to your side, our side?
Well, look, it's a great question. Let me say, first of all, being a conservative in Massachusetts shows you got backbone. And I'll confess, I went to law school in Massachusetts at Harvard.
I went down in Philadelphia.
Yeah. Well,
I won't say where.
I saw your hat. Every time I was out in West Texas and people found out I went to Harvard, I immediately had to say, look, I got a lot to apologize. But I'll tell you my dad's view. He talked about my time up at Harvard as missionary work. You know, the question of how to win, let's take people in Massachusetts and let's take more broadly, let's talk about how you win an election generally. You know, what is maddening about politics is there is this group of consultants in Washington who keep running national campaigns, and they keep losing. And then they keep coming back to Republicans saying, support us, while we go make the exact same mistakes all over again.
Mm-hmm.
Look, I think the stakes are high. We either win in 2016, or if we have 4 or 8 more years of this, we risk doing irreparable damage to the greatest nation in the history of the world. And so we got to look to the data and the numbers. If you compare 2004, the last race Republicans won, to 08 and 12, by far the biggest difference are the millions of conservatives who showed up in 04, who stayed home in 08, and stayed home in even bigger numbers in 2012. So how do you win? How do you win? I think the key question is, how do we bring back those millions of conservatives? Now, here's what I call the Washington fallacy, which is what the consultants believe. They look at voters on a spectrum from right to left. And their view is, if your opponent is here, you want to be infinitesimally to the right. So you capture every marginal voter right up until where they are. Now, I understand that theory in the abstract. It's not a crazy theory in the abstract. The problem is we keep trying it, and we keep losing. Because every time you do that, millions and millions of people over here say to heck with it and stay home. The way you win is you draw a line in the sand. You make a clear, meaningful distinction why this election matters to you, and 2 things happen. Number 1, you turn out millions of conservatives. But number 2, and this goes right to your question, it's also how you earn crossover votes. If you think about it, in the last 50 years, there's one Republican who has a group of Democrats named after him. Reagan Democrats. If the Washington theory were right, you'd have Gerald Ford Democrats or Bob Dole Democrats. They don't exist. You think about 1980. You can understand why. In 1980, Ronald Reagan didn't say, I am exactly like Jimmy Carter. Except imperceptibly to the right. Now, Reagan drew a line in the sand. He said, there is a fundamental difference between me and Jimmy Carter. President Carter believes government is the answer to every need, want, and desire in your life. I think government's the problem. And you can get why. Let's say you're a Michigan's auto worker. You've been a Democrat your whole life. Your parents were Democrats your whole life. If you go in to vote and the two candidates are neck and neck, if they're indistinguishable, what are you going to do? You vote Democrat. That's your team. That's your side. Why would you switch? What happened in 1980 is there was a sharp difference between the two, and millions of FDR Democrats, blue-collar, union members, working class, gun owners, pro-life, strong national defense. Millions of them said, hey, those are my values. And even though for generations their families had been Democrats, they crossed over. So I'll tell you the answer, and look, when you talk about Massachusetts, you got a lot of working class men and women, a lot of Irish and Italian, and I'm half Irish and Italian. Working men and women, this election in 2016 needs to be a populist campaign on behalf of hardworking men and women of this country against the corruption of Washington. Well, go ahead.
Again, support your values, but I'm not sure that the analogy really goes through some perspective.
Although if you look at Anderson, Anderson did not get a whole lot of votes that election, and he was running as a liberal Republican, and so he was picking off more liberals. And if you look at the Reagan Democrats, I'll tell you, when I was elected in Texas, Reagan Democrats, the working men and women, were a critical part of our coalition. And that's who we've got to be fighting for. And by the way, we have a great opportunity. The last couple of years, Democrats have done something remarkable. They've chosen between two traditional favored children of the Democratic Party. They've made the strategic decision to go with the money from California environmentalist billionaires instead of the jobs for union members. I think Republicans need to go and make a hard play for union members that we are